Imagine a mother, a queen, standing helpless as her daughters scream. Soldiers hold them down, iron hands crushing fragile limbs, laughter echoing in a language foreign and cruel. The mother herself has been flogged, stripped of dignity before her people, whipped bloody in the dust. And when her daughter's cries tear the air, something ancient awakens in her chest. Not just rage, but a fire so consuming it will set half of Britain ablaze. This isn't just the story of Boudica, the warrior queen. This is the story of the night Rome crossed a line it could never uncross. When they violated her daughters, they didn't just dishonor a family, they ignited a rebellion so furious, so apocalyptic, that entire cities would burn to ash and Roman legions would drown in blood. And here's the forbidden truth. The empire thought it could crush a woman. Instead, it unleashed a goddess of vengeance who would make emperors tremble. The wind howled across the flatlands of East Anglia, bending the heather and rattling the wooden palisades of the Iceni stronghold. Smoke from cooking fires curled into the sky, carrying the smell of roasted meat and herbs. But inside the walls, there was no peace. Tension hung over the settlement like a storm about to break. Her fiery hair, unbound, whipped against her face in the bitter wind, but her eyes burned brighter than any flame. She was no stranger to hardship. She had ruled beside her husband, King Prasutagus, who had walked a delicate line between submission and defiance under Rome's suffocating grip. Prasutagus had tried to save his people through compromise. He had left his will naming both the emperor and his daughters as heirs, hoping to buy peace with gold and submission. But peace was a lie Rome never intended to honor. When Prasutagus died, the Romans came like wolves to a carcass. They stripped the Iceni of land, wealth, and pride. Boudica, once treated as queen, was dragged into the dirt, tied to a post, and flogged until her back was a ruin of blood and torn flesh. Her daughters, girls barely grown, innocent of politics, of war, of Rome's cruelty, were dragged before their people, humiliated and violated by Roman soldiers. The air was thick with silence that day, broken only by her daughter's sobs and the jeers of Rome's men. For the Iceni it was more than violence, it was sacrilege. A queen defiled was a goddess desecrated, a daughter violated was a future poisoned. And every man, woman, and child who watched felt the shame burn into their bones. Boudica staggered as they released her, her legs trembling, her blood soaking the earth. She gathered her daughters in her arms, her voice whispering in a tongue older than Rome. She promised them that their pain would not be forgotten, that their cries would echo into vengeance. And the people, silent though they were, felt a seed planted in their chests, a seed of rage, of resistance, of war. That night, the fires in the Iceni stronghold burned low, but none slept. Mothers wept, fathers clenched fists until nails dug into flesh. Children stared wide-eyed at the dark, too young to understand, but old enough to feel the shift in the world around them. Rome had taken too much. Rome had broken the line. Boudica sat by the fire, her daughters sleeping fitfully beside her, their small bodies trembling with nightmares. She stared into the flames, seeing not wood burning but cities aflame. She saw Londinium, the Roman jewel, reduced to ashes. She saw legions broken on the battlefield, their banners trampled into mud. She saw vengeance so complete it would scorch the empire itself. She was no longer just a queen. She was the vessel of her people's fury. She was vengeance incarnate. But vengeance needs more than rage. It needs allies. It needs strategy. And Boudica, bloodied but unbroken, began to plan. She sent messengers to the Trinovantes, 2 tribes long chafing under Roman tribute. She reminded them of their temples stolen, their families enslaved, their gods mocked. She reminded them that Rome had no honor, that submission only led to chains. And one by one, tribes answered. The rebellion spread like fire on dry grass. In the flickering firelight of her hall, Boudica rose to address her people. Her voice cracked with grief, but carried the thunder of destiny. She lifted her arms, her whip-scarred back, a testament to Rome's cruelty. They think us weak. They think us broken. But hear me now. We will show them what it means to defy an empire. We will show them what it means to make a goddess weep and a mother bleed. We will burn them from this land until not even their ashes remain. Her people roared their answer, a sound not of men and women, but of warriors reborn. And in that moment, the rebellion was no longer a dream. It was a promise, but vengeance is not without cost. Boudica knew the path ahead was drenched in blood, that Rome would not fall easily. She knew her daughters, though broken, must walk this path beside her, symbols of all that had been stolen. They were no longer just children. They were the torches that would light the fire. And as dawn broke over Iceni lands, the first sparks of war ignited. Boudica mounted her chariot, her daughters beside her, their faces pale, but their eyes burning. She raised her spear to the sky, the wind tearing through her hair, and the people cried out her name. The queen had risen. The goddess of vengeance had awakened, and Britain itself would burn. The morning after her vow of vengeance, the Iceni camp was alive with a fire that no hearth could match. Smoke rose from cooking fires, the clang of sharpened iron echoed across the fields, and the murmur of voices carried like thunder on the wind. Boudica had lit something within her people, something ancient and dangerous, the belief that Rome could bleed. She rode her chariot through the camp, her daughters beside her. The scars on her back burned with every jolt of the wheels, but she wore them like armor. Her daughters, though shaken and silent, had a new fire in their eyes. They no longer appeared as fragile children, but as symbols, living proof of Rome's cruelty, and a living call to arms for every Celt who saw them. The Iceni were not alone for long. Word spread like wildfire, traveling through forests, over hills, across rivers. Messengers carried tales of Rome's outrage, the flogged queen, the violated daughters, the insult to the gods. And one by one, other tribes who had bent the knee to Rome now raised their heads in defiance. The Trinovantes were the first to join. Their hatred of Rome ran deep. Their lands had been seized to build the massive temple to Claudius at Camulodunum, a looming fortress of stone that stood as a monument to their oppression. To them, Boudica's cry was not just a summons, but an answer to their silent prayers. They gathered their warriors, painted their bodies in woad, and marched to her side. Next came the Catuvillani, old enemies of the Iceni, but even rivalry drowned beneath the tide of rage. One by one, tribes came forth, men with spears, women with torches, children who carried stones and knives. In the clearing of a great oak grove, they gathered in thousands. a sea of faces, hardened by years of Roman humiliation. Boudica stood before them all. Her chariot gleamed with bronze fittings, her hair unbound like a halo of fire. Her daughters clung to her sides, not as ornaments, but as wounds for all to see. When she raised her spear, silence fell like a curtain. "Romans think we are animals," she cried, her voice carrying like the wind itself. "They think us slaves, our women spoils, our gods forgotten. They flogged me as if I were nothing. They defiled my daughters as if they were less than human. But today I say this: we are not broken. We are not conquered. We are Britain, and we will rise." The roar that answered shook the very ground. Spears banged against shields, torches flared, war cries tore into the sky. It was more than an army. It was a people reborn. That night the Druids lit great fires in the groves, chanting to the gods of war and vengeance. Flames leaped into the sky, sparks flying like stars, as warriors swore oaths beneath the ancient oaks. Boudica's daughters stood beside her, dressed in white cloaks, their hair bound with leaves, their faces solemn as priestesses. The Druids marked their brows with blood, declaring them the living voices of Nemesis, the goddess of divine retribution. And so the rebellion gained not just men and weapons, but sanctity. To fight under Boudica was not only war, it was holy vengeance. The first target was clear: Camulodunum, the Roman colony, the temple fortress, the symbol of their arrogance. Built on stolen land, filled with settlers who mocked the Britons, guarded only by a small garrison of veterans. It was ripe for destruction. The march began under a sky heavy with clouds. Boudica's army stretched for miles, warriors chanting, banners fluttering, chariots rattling across the earth. Women walked with the men, carrying blades and torches. Even children trailed behind, clutching stones. It was not just a force of war. It was the soul of a nation on the move. As they neared Camulodunum, scouts brought word of the settlers. The Romans had laughed when they first heard of the rebellion. They thought the Britons nothing more than rabble, incapable of breaching their mighty temple. They drank, they mocked, they sneered, but they did not laugh for long. Boudica's army descended like a storm. The settlers fled behind the temple walls, begging the gods for salvation. But no Roman gods answered. The Britons surrounded the colony, cutting off escape. With screams that echoed into the heavens, they broke through the gates, fire licking at the sky. Camulodunum burned. Streets ran with blood. The temple to Claudius, once a symbol of Rome's eternal power, became a tomb as Britons set it ablaze with its defenders trapped inside. Flames swallowed the stone, smoke blotting out the sun. The colony was erased in a single day, nothing left but ash and ruin. Boudica watched it burn from her chariot, her daughters at her side. The scars on her back throbbed, the memory of her humiliation still raw. But as the flames roared higher, she felt the first taste of vengeance. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was a beginning. The news traveled faster than fire itself. The Romans were stunned. A colony destroyed, its citizens slaughtered, its temple reduced to rubble, and not by a legion, but by a queen and her tribes. Panic spread through the Roman settlements like a disease. Londinium trembled. Verulamium whispered of doom. But Boudica did not stop. Her eyes were already on Londinium, the beating heart of Roman Britain. And if Camulodunum had burned, then London would drown in fire and blood. The rebellion was no longer just vengeance. It was apocalypse. And as her army marched on, as her daughters rode with her through smoke and ruin, Boudica became more than queen, more than woman. She became the storm itself. Smoke still clung to the horizon where Camulodunum had burned, and the air carried the metallic temps of ash and blood. But Boudica's army did not linger to savor their victory. The taste of vengeance was sharp and addictive, and once swallowed, it demanded more. They had destroyed a Roman colony, yes, but that was only the beginning. The true jewel of Roman Britain still waited, fat and vulnerable, on the banks of the Thames, Londinium. At dawn, Boudica rose from her chariot, her hair wild, her body still marked by whip scars that seemed to glow like brands in the morning light. Her daughters stood beside her, faces pale but fierce, clad in white cloaks that made them look almost otherworldly, like living omens. The warriors gathered around, tens of thousands of them now, Iceni, Trinovantes, and others who had thrown off Rome's yoke to join the tide of rebellion. Boudica raised her spear. "Camulodunum has fallen," she cried, her voice carrying across the mass of warriors. "But Rome is not yet broken. Their heart lies ahead, Londinium, rich with plunder, crawling with settlers who mock us, who take our land, who call us slaves. Shall we show them what it means to cross Britain's daughters?" A roar answered her, deafening, primal. Spears slammed against shields. War cries tore into the sky. The warriors were no longer just men and women. They were a storm given flesh. The march to Londinium was relentless. Chariots rattled across the roads, horses thundered, and the people of the countryside fled before the advancing host. Word reached the city long before the army did. Panic swept through Londinium. Merchants scrambled to gather goods. Roman citizens packed their wagons, and mothers clutched children as they tried to flee inside the city. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, faced an impossible choice. He had been campaigning in Wales, crushing Druids at Mona. When news of the rebellion reached him, he rushed south, but when he reached Londinium, he saw the truth. He did not have the numbers to defend it. His legion was too small, his cavalry too thin. To stay meant annihilation. And so he did the unthinkable. He abandoned the city. He ordered the able-bodied to follow him north and left Londinium's people to their fate. Imagine the terror in the streets as the governor rode away, the clatter of hooves fading, leaving behind a city filled with screams. The gates closed, but walls cannot stop fire. And Boudica was bringing fire. The army descended upon Londinium like a tidal wave. The gates were smashed open, the streets flooded with warriors painted in woad, their eyes wild with fury. Houses were broken into, settlers dragged into the open, the cries of women and children piercing the air. Gold was seized, treasures plundered, but Boudica's vengeance was not for wealth, it was for blood. The city burned. Flames devoured timber houses, smoke blotted out the sky, roofs collapsed as the firestorm roared. The Thames reflected the inferno, its waters choked with bodies. The Roman settlers, who had laughed at the barbarian queen, now begged for mercy, but there was none. For every lash on Boudica's back, for every tear of her daughters, the Britons exacted tenfold payment. Boudica stood in her chariot, watching the inferno with eyes that did not blink. Her daughters clutched her sides, their faces streaked with soot and tears. She did not shield them from the sight. They had been made into symbols, and symbols must witness. They saw the city collapse. They heard the wails. They breathed the smoke. The lesson was etched into their bones. Rome had brought shame to them, and Rome was now reaping its own shame in flames. By the time the fires died, Londinium was gone. A city of thousands lay in ruins, its wealth plundered, its citizens slaughtered, its streets a charnel ground. The richest colony in Roman Britain had been reduced to ash in days. But vengeance is greedy, and fire always hungers. Boudica's fury did not cool with London's destruction. She turned her eyes north, toward Verulamium, another Roman settlement swollen with arrogance and settlers. On the march, her army grew larger still. Tribes poured in, emboldened by victory, drawn to the fire like moths to flame. Some came out of desperation, some out of loyalty, but all came with hatred. Boudica now commanded a host that some chroniclers claim swelled beyond 100,000. More than a rebellion, it was an uprising of an entire people in Londinium's ashes. The Romans found horror. Survivors stumbled north to join Suetonius, their faces blackened, their voices hoarse. They spoke of slaughter so complete that even the unborn were not spared. They spoke of a queen whose fury matched the gods themselves. They spoke of daughters whose pain had become prophecy. Suetonius, grim and calculating, listened in silence. He knew Rome could not ignore this storm. He knew they would need to strike, and strike hard. But first, Boudica had to be allowed to burn herself out. Meanwhile, the rebellion surged on. Verulamium fell, just as Londinium had. The city was sacked, its people butchered, its streets drowned in fire. 3 Roman settlements had been wiped from the map, their ruins smoldering testaments to Rome's arrogance and Britain's fury. But each victory came with a shadow. The Britons were untrained, their forces vast but undisciplined. They relied on rage, on sheer numbers, on the hunger for vengeance. Rome, though bloodied, still had its legions, still had discipline, still had steel. Boudica did not care. She rode at the head of her host, her daughters beside her, her voice rising above the roar of tens of thousands. She was no longer merely queen, she was vengeance incarnate, a storm in human form. And though her army left ashes in their wake, the storm was moving toward its final clash. For Suetonius was not done. He was gathering his strength. He was waiting. And when the storm and the legion finally met, Britain itself would tremble. But on this night, as the flames of Verulamium joined the smoke of Londinium, Boudica looked upon her daughters and whispered, "They thought us broken. Look how they burn." The fires of Londinium and Verulamium still smoldered, their ruins glowing faintly like coals buried beneath ash. The smoke drifted across the countryside, a visible scar that told all of Britain Rome had been humbled. And yet, deep in the forests and along the Roman roads, there was a sense that the storm had not yet reached its full fury. For while Boudica's armies marched with vengeance, Rome was not idle. Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor, was a man of ruthless discipline. He had crushed Druids in Anglesey, slaughtered them on their sacred isle, and burned their groves. He was not unfamiliar with fanatic enemies, nor was he unfamiliar with fire. When word came that Boudica had razed 3 cities, killing tens of thousands. He did not despair. He tightened his grip. He gathered what remained of his forces, called in reinforcements, and forged a plan that would decide the fate of Roman Britain. Boudica, meanwhile, drove her people forward with the momentum of a storm. Her chariot thundered along Roman roads, now cracked and broken with ash, her daughters beside her. They were no longer children. Their eyes burned with the fire of vengeance. Their names whispered as omens wherever the army passed. Warriors invoked them as proof of Rome's cruelty, rallying their courage with chants of their suffering. The host was immense. Some chroniclers speak of more than 100,000, others even greater. It was not merely an army, but a flood, a tidal wave of humanity surging across the land. Men with spears, women with torches, chariots rattling with bronze fittings, banners of wolves and dragons and ravens flapping in the wind. Even the Druids marched, their chants rising above the thunder of feet. And yet, for all their fury, there was something fragile in the heart of the host. They carried families with them, wives, children, elders, their wagons trailing behind like a village on the move. It was vengeance, yes, but also desperation. A people trying to burn away their shame by bringing everything they had to war as they advanced. Boudica stopped at sacred groves, standing before her army as the Druids lit fires and spilled blood in sacrifice. She raised her arms and called upon Andraste, the goddess of victory, swearing that her people would never submit again. Her voice carried like thunder, her daughters standing beside her as living proof of Rome's sins. The army roared their approval. They were ready to face Rome's legions, and Rome was ready to face them. Suetonius chose his battlefield carefully. He could not match Boudica's numbers. His legions were fewer than 10,000, disciplined, yes, but dwarfed by the mass that marched under Boudica's banner. To meet her in the open would be suicide, so he chose a narrow gorge, a place where the forest closed in and the open ground narrowed to a funnel. He placed his men in a tight line, shields locked, pila ready, cavalry flanking. The terrain itself would protect his flanks. The Britons would have to charge head-on, their numbers useless in the choke of the gorge. The two forces faced one another across the field. Boudica rode her chariot along the front lines, her daughters standing tall beside her, their white cloaks billowing. Her fiery hair streamed like a banner in the wind. She raised her spear and cried out, "We fight not for wealth, not for empire, but for freedom. They call us slaves, they whip us, they rape our daughters, they steal our land. Let Rome learn today, we are not their subjects. We are their doom." The warriors howled in reply, beating their shields, stamping their feet. The sound rolled like thunder, shaking the very earth behind them. The wagons carrying families formed a ring, women and children climbing atop to watch. The entire nation seemed gathered for this battle, not just soldiers, but every soul who had suffered under Rome's yoke. The signal was given. The Britons surged forward in a tidal wave of flesh and fury. Spears thrust, chariots rattled, war cries pierced the sky. The sound was overwhelming, a roar that seemed it would sweep the Romans away. But the legions did not move. Suetonius raised his hand, calm, calculating, waiting until the Britons were almost upon them. Then, like a thunderclap, his command rang out. 1,000 javelins flew at once, arcing high and plunging into the onrushing crowd. Britons fell in droves, skewered by iron, their charge stumbling. Before the survivors could recover, another volley tore through them. Chariots crashed, horses screamed, warriors collapsed. Still they pressed on, their rage too great to stop. And then they struck the Roman line. The clash was like the collision of worlds. Britons slammed against shields, hacking with axes and spears, screaming in rage. But the Roman line held, shields locked tight, swords darted out in deadly thrusts, stabbing into unarmored flesh. The Britons hacked and roared, but they could not break the wall of iron. Slowly, the Roman line advanced, step by step, driving the Britons back. The narrow gorge worked against them, their numbers choked, unable to spread, unable to surround. Those behind pressed forward, those in front were crushed. The mass turning into chaos, Suetonius gave the signal, and the cavalry swept around the flanks, cutting down warriors trapped against their own wagons. Panic spread through the Britons. What had been a tidal wave became a bottleneck. Bodies crushed together, screams drowning in the press. From her chariot, Boudica watched the tide turn. She screamed for her people to stand, to fight, to remember their suffering. But the Roman machine ground forward, relentless, unbreakable. Her daughters clung to her, their faces pale with terror as the army around them broke. The wagons became a trap. Warriors fled, but their families blocked the way. Men, women, and children alike were caught in the slaughter. The narrow field became a killing ground, a river of blood. Tens of thousands fell, their cries echoing into the sky, and still Boudica fought. She drove her chariot through the chaos, her spear flashing, her voice carrying above the din. She would not flee, she would not surrender. But even fury cannot fight iron forever. The rebellion crumbled, the host shattered, the dream of freedom drowned in blood. By the end of the day, the gorge was piled with corpses. Some say 80,000 Britons died there, while the Romans lost fewer than 400. The rebellion had been fire, fierce and bright, but it had been quenched in a single battle. Boudica vanished into the smoke of that defeat. Some say she fled into the forest, drank poison, and died with dignity. Others claim she sickened soon after, her body broken by grief. The truth remains lost as the voices of her daughters who disappear from the chronicles after that day. But even in defeat, the rebellion left its mark. Rome had been shaken, nearly broken, its cities burned, its pride humbled, and Boudica, the queen, the mother, the storm, had carved her name into the heart of Britain forever. The battlefield lay silent but for the carrion birds. Where once had been the cries of tens of thousands, now lay only the whisper of wind and the crackle of fires still smoldering in the wreckage. The gorge that had been Boudica's last stand was a charnel ground, bodies piled so thick that the earth itself seemed swallowed by death. The Romans, disciplined even in victory, moved among the corpses, stripping weapons, gathering armor, and burning what they could not carry. To them, it was the work of cleansing. To the Britons who survived, it was the silencing of a dream. Boudica herself was nowhere to be found. Chroniclers disagreed even in their own time. Some wrote that she fled into the forests and took poison, unwilling to be paraded through Rome in chains like a defeated barbarian queen. Others claimed she sickened after the battle, her body broken by years of struggle and grief, her spirit finally giving out. What all agreed upon was this: she never saw another battlefield, and her rebellion, fierce as wildfire, ended with her. Her daughters, the very reason for her vengeance, vanished into silence. Their names were never recorded. No Roman chronicler bothered to preserve the voices of violated girls. No Druidic songs survived to tell whether they lived or died. Did they fall in the slaughter beside their mother's army, their blood joining the thousands on that cursed field? Did they slip away into the forests, hidden by loyal tribes, their lives spared but haunted forever? Or did they too drink poison, their final breath a refusal to let Rome own them? History does not say. Their silence is a wound that never healed. For the survivors, the defeat was more than military. It was spiritual. The people who had risen in fury, who had burned cities and toppled temples, now staggered back into the forests like shadows. The rebellion had promised freedom. The reality was massacre. And yet, even in defeat, something had changed. Rome had been terrified. 3 cities erased, tens of thousands of settlers slaughtered, an entire province nearly lost. Boudica had shown the empire that Britain was not a tame land, and her name would haunt governors and generals for decades to come. Suetonius Paulinus, though victorious, knew the danger was not over. His legions were exhausted, his province scarred. For all his triumph, he could not rebuild what had been burned overnight. He ruled with iron discipline, punishing tribes suspected of rebellion, forcing submission through brutality. And yet his superiors in Rome, wary of another spark of uprising, soon replaced him with a governor of more tempered hand. Rome had learned that oppression could breed fire, and though they rebuilt their cities, they ruled Britain with more caution than before. But what of Boudica herself? For Romans, she was a barbarian, a woman who dared to defy the eternal empire, punished justly for her insolence. For Britons, she was something more, a legend, a goddess of vengeance, a spirit who embodied their rage. Around campfires, stories grew. They spoke of her fiery hair streaming like a comet as she rode her chariot into battle. They spoke of her daughters, silent but fierce, their suffering transformed into prophecy. They spoke of how, even in defeat, she had struck fear into the hearts of Rome itself. Some whispered that she did not die at all, but melted into the forests, her spirit bound to the land, waiting to rise again when Britain was in chains. The Druids, those who survived Rome's slaughter at Mona, carried her memory into their chants, weaving her name into prayers for vengeance that would never fade. And centuries later, when Rome itself faltered, when its legions abandoned Britain to its own fate, the shadow of Boudica seemed to rise once more, a reminder that empires can burn. Yet at the heart of her story lies a silence heavier than all the flames. The daughters, their cries began the rebellion, their suffering lit the fire, their presence on the chariot gave meaning to the vengeance. And yet their voices vanish. Rome erased them, history ignored them, and only their mother's fury preserves their memory. It is as though they were swallowed by the same silence that devoured the battlefield. Imagine them, if they survived, walking through the forests in the days after, cloaked in rags, their hair matted with smoke, their eyes haunted. Did they feel their mother's spirit beside them, urging them to endure? Did they whisper their names in secret, afraid that Rome would find them? Did they grow old in obscurity, carrying the weight of a rebellion that had turned them from girls into symbols. Or imagine them dead, their small bodies among the thousands, their lives cut short by the very vengeance they had inspired. If so, then the battlefield was not only the death of a rebellion, but the grave of innocence itself. Boudica's story might have ended in smoke, but her legend endured. Tacitus and Dio, Roman historians, wrote of her, painting her alternately as a monstrous fury and as a tragic avenger. To them, she was a curiosity, a woman who had dared to lead men, dared to defy an empire, dared to make Rome bleed. To the Britons, she was more than words in foreign scrolls. She was proof that even the mighty could fall. And to us, centuries later, she is still fire. Fire that burns in the silence of history. Fire that flickers in the ruins of ancient Londinium. Fire that whispers in the stones of Colchester, St. Alban, and every field where her people fell. The Romans rebuilt their cities. They raised new temples, laid fresh roads, reasserted their power. But beneath the stones, beneath the walls, beneath the polished marble, Britain remembered. And in that memory, Boudica lived on. The flames had died, the screams had faded, and yet the story of Boudica did not end with her defeat. Like smoke carried on the wind, her legend spread, lingering in whispers, in memories, in the cracks of Roman walls. The queen who had risen from the ashes of humiliation to scorch half of Roman Britain did not vanish so easily. She became myth, and myth is more enduring than flesh in Rome itself. Her rebellion was reported with a mixture of horror and fascination. Chroniclers like Tacitus recorded her deeds with a grudging respect, while Cassius Dio, writing a century later, painted her as a terrifying fury, a giant of a woman with piercing eyes and a voice like thunder. They spoke of her chariot racing through the ranks, of her fiery hair streaming behind her, of her speech to her warriors. To the Romans, she was both barbarian and queen, a paradox that unsettled their tidy view of empire. They could defeat her body, but they could not erase the fear she inspired. In Britain, her name took on the shape of prophecy. The tribes whispered that she had not died at all, that she had melted into the forests, taken into the earth by the gods to rise again when her people called. Some said her daughters walked beside her in spirit, their cries echoing through the trees, their suffering turned into sacred vows. Others claimed that the rivers carried her soul, that every time the Thames flooded its banks, it was Boudica's spirit roaring against Rome. Her daughters remained the silent heart of the legend. Their voices, erased from history, were reimagined as omens, as priestesses, as goddesses. They had been the victims, but in myth they became the spark, the torches that lit Britain's vengeance. And though Rome would not name them, their absence became its own kind of power. Silence is often louder than words. The Romans tried to rebuild, but the scars of the rebellion ran deep. Londinium, Camulodunum, Verulamium, all rebuilt in stone, stronger than before. Their forums and temples rising again as if to declare Rome eternal. But beneath those streets, beneath the layers of brick and marble, lay the ashes of the dead, the charred bones of settlers and soldiers alike. Every step upon those stones carried the memory of the fire Boudica had unleashed for the Britons. Her defeat was bitter, but her rebellion became a rallying cry. Parents told their children of the queen who defied the empire, of the mother whose daughters had been wronged, of the fury that burned cities to the ground. They spoke not of defeat, but of the fire itself. For even in loss, Boudica had shown that Rome could bleed. As the years passed, her name did not fade. When Rome finally abandoned Britain in the 5th century, when their legions marched away and never returned, the shadow of Boudica seemed to rise again. The land she had fought for was once more free of the eagle's grip. And though centuries of Saxons, Danes, and Normans would follow, her story endured in fragments, carried forward until it was written again. Long after her bones had turned to dust, in later ages she was reimagined. To Elizabethan England, she was a symbol of defiance, a queen who embodied national pride. To Victorians, she was the mother of the nation, her chariot immortalized in bronze beside the Thames, her daughters forever by her side. Each era shaped her to its needs, but always, at the core, remained the story of a woman who rose from pain and humiliation to challenge the greatest empire the world had known. And still, her daughters linger in silence. No names, no fates, no graves. They are shadows on the edge of history, girls whose suffering sparked an inferno. Perhaps that silence is fitting, for silence compels us to imagine, to fill the void with meaning. Were they broken children, or were they symbols transformed into eternal flame? Were they lost in the blood-soaked gorge, or did they live to carry their mother's memory into hidden villages, whispering her name to their own children? We will never know. What we do know is this: the daughter's suffering lit the fire, and the mother carried it until it consumed all in its path. Rome believed it could break a woman, but in doing so, it forged a legend. Even now, when the Thames rolls dark beneath London's bridges, when the streets bustle with life above ancient ruins, her presence lingers. The statue of Boudica still faces the Houses of Parliament, her daughters beside her, her chariot rearing as if to charge once more. Tourists pass, snapping photos, unaware that beneath their feet lie the ashes of a city she once turned to cinders. Boudica is not gone. She lives in every act of defiance, in every refusal to submit, in every whisper that says empires are not eternal. She lives in the silence of her daughters, in the fire that memory carries, in the unbroken cry of freedom that echoes across centuries. And so, the story ends not in defeat, but in endurance. Rome won the battle. Rome rebuilt its cities. But Boudica and her daughters won something greater. They became eternal.